This is SaaS Therapy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of SaaS Therapy, the show where we help you save your most important business relationships, your customers. I'm your host, Todd Kirk, and today I'm joined by a new friend that I got to meet at the SEDMA Empower Conference earlier this year, Julie Dirksen. Julie is awesome. She is a best-selling author. She's written some books that, if you're in the customer education world, you might have come across before. Designed for How People Learn and Talk to the Elephant. Amazing books. Really worth a read if you haven't seen them before. Julie is also the leader of Usable Learning, and super fun to have her actually be willing to join on the show because she gave a keynote address that I loved. It just was awesome. So Julie, welcome to SaaS Therapy. Happy to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks. Happy to be here.
So maybe for context for our audience, maybe I always like to learn a little bit about people's journeys and how they got into what they do. Like, how did you fall into the, well, I don't know if you fell into it or it was super intentional, but how did you end up in this space of I guess, adult learning and helping us understand how to better change our behavior?
I think the origin story of many, many, many people in the field is, hey, you're a good insert job title here. Like, hey, you're a good customer service rep. Do you want to help train the customer service reps? Which is actually great because it means that the people who typically wind up doing this work are the people who naturally are like the smart people who kind of figure it out and then other people go to for help. So we're a big bunch of helpers, which means that I think we're nicer than some other professions just because it's something that attracts people who really get, are happy helping other people and happy figuring things out and had that curiosity and some of those kinds of things. And so it's been really fun. I was hey, you're good at this financial services data entry. Do you want to train the other financial services data entry people kind of thing? What I found out when I was doing training kind of, as the main role was that I really liked kind of putting the materials together and I really enjoyed the technology. And that sort of led me down a path of kind of instructional design. I went and got a master's in educational technology and turns out I'm happy as long as I get to learn something new and it doesn't matter that much what it is. It's like, sure, tell me about brake systems or disability claims. How does that work? That's interesting. So I love the job, and I've moved into more of like, how do we unpack kind of what works and what doesn't work and what really makes for effective learning experiences for people, and then helping other people sort of level up in that regard in terms of their own practice.
Love that. It's so good. One of the things that caught my attention in your talk was just how receptive I felt like the audience you were talking to was to your message, mostly because people in the customer education world, especially like for SaaS companies, which is where we met, right? There's all these people who primarily work for software companies who are trying to help their end users learn how to use the software. And I think there's a lot around how we learn and what is the most important things to focus on in that process, and how to help somebody stop resisting the need to move on from an old way of doing something. And in my experience, there's a lot of there's a little bit of a knowledge gap that exists, not necessarily with the instructional designers and the learning professionals, but between them and the customers and the leaders that they're trying to support. In your experience, what would you say are maybe some of the biggest blockers that prevent us from like getting on this road? Why is it that it seems so hard for someone who knows how to drive learning, how to address change, to get alignment across all these different groups?
Yeah, and it's one of these things where it really is kind of an alignment issue, I think, making sure that you understand what their pain points are. Because I've seen a lot of instructional designers who are like advocating for good learning experiences for their end users, which is great, which is absolutely great. But if that's not a pain point for the leadership, a pain point for stakeholders, it may be that they would buy in if they just understood kind of the difference in it and things like that. I also have a bit of a background in some user experience design, although I haven't done much of that later, but I spent a lot of time over in that part of the university and graduate school and things like that. And one of the interesting things was user testing, which I'm a huge advocate of. Like, test out your solutions, watch actual people use them, and then you'll understand. Because I found that I would go back to the developers and I'd be like, this is a problem. They had struggled with this. And they're like, really? Could they not figure it out? It's so obvious, all this kind of stuff. And then I started actually showing the developers some of the clips from the user testing, and they're like, oh, we got to fix that. And so some of it is, how do you make it feel real to people? How do you make it feel like not an abstract good to have effective customer education, but how does this actually play into things that are currently causing me headaches, as opposed to, so I understand what you're saying, but I have other things that are more important or more compelling for me to worry about right now. And when we were talking about it in the keynote, it was kind of going up and going down. Like, how do you show value to stakeholders? You can't unless you know what they care about. You can't show value unless you understand where their pain points are. And how do you show value to the end users or things like that so that they actually go, yeah, this will help me. This will let me do a thing. I'm a huge Kathy Sierra fan. So if people aren't familiar with her stuff, her book on badass users is, I think, a classic and absolutely something. And the thing that she says in that is, nobody wants to hear how great your product is. They want to hear that they're going to be able to do great things with your products. And as education providers, we have the same issue, right? Like, don't tell me this is going to be a good learning experience. Tell me that this is going to be a good learning experience that causes customers to really fall in love with this product and get really attached to it, because they're going to start to use all these advanced features that don't exist in maybe a competing product, and therefore they're not going to want to switch. Be able to connect the dots between what's an effective learning experience, but then also what does that actually do for end users? What does that do for stakeholders? What does that do for everybody in the system? Because I believe that, good learning experiences are incredibly powerful, but we can't just kind of come in and being like, that's a bad learning experience, we should do better. Only half the message, or maybe a third or something like that.
Yeah, it's so cool. I remember back all the way when I was in college, there was this speaker for a company out of here in Utah called Climate, and they make like winter gear and sleeping bags,
Sure. Yep.
jackets and stuff. But the way they started the company it was super interesting, because I love your point about connecting dots. One of the things that the founder, he was giving a lecture and to a bunch of entrepreneur students. One of the things that he was like, I was scuba diving, and while I was scuba diving, I learned that they would run noble gases through a dry suit to act as an insulation barrier, and it allowed you to regulate your body temperature while you're deep underwater. And and so the reason he started the company was because he was from Utah and he liked to ski. And he realized that, man, when I ski, I have this big, I have to have like 50 layers on. I get really hot. I have
Uh-huh.
to take them off. And then he was like, what if I just like had a nitrogen cartridge, or then I ran that
Uh,
through the jacket? And so what's cool is like what your point of, like, it's not just what the software does, but it's how you can apply it to you that matters
mhm.
so much. And, it was interesting because he was telling that whole story. Climate today doesn't even make those jackets anymore. I think they were kind of impractical, but that was like what led him to starting his company, was because he had this idea that where he saw
Mhm.
one tool and he connected it to something meaningful in his own life. And so the thing that I find so fascinating about behavior change in general is like you have to first be able to even contemplate that you could get to some different spot, but then
Yeah.
actually driving that change forward is really difficult. And so I guess, what advice would you have for people who maybe have connected a dot, or for themselves or for their audience, but they still feel like they're not seeing that change occur, and they still feel like it's not getting where it needs to go?
Yeah, and I think it's really about having those conversations, right? If you're not getting enough information about what your stakeholders care about, or you're not getting enough information about what your end users care about, how can you start those conversations? How can you connect those? You can't connect the dots if you don't know where they are with other people, because by definition, it's matching up what you offer to what their perceived need is. And if you don't know, you can make assumptions about what you think they need, which is maybe right,
Yeah.
but
And I mean, like in the case of the story I told you, it was like by pure kind of accident, not accident so much as, but like his brain just made a connection. It was random. It wasn't like he was intentionally thinking about this.
right, right. And he was representing, I'm part of this community of people who ski, and being able to regulate my temperature while I ski is a big part of, it's a real struggle. And look, here's a solution. And now I can connect these dots up. And so he was able to be sort of audience member one for the product that he was developing, which is great. Now, the issue with that is you can't stay in that sort of naive audience one position for that long. So that's an assumption that happens, right? Like, oh, I used to do this job 15 years ago, so I know how they think. Well,
Right. Yeah,
maybe.
I think that's a fair point. And even the fact that I love that point of like, well, oftentimes that audience one is like we have those people who are I mean, I don't know enough about the neuroscience and the stuff that you've studied and put in your books enough to be able to articulate why this might be, but some people seem to be more receptive to trying out new things, right? You talk about the kind of the innovation curve and you have your early adopters and your innovators who are jump on a new idea really quickly. They might see the hype or the possibility with a tool much faster and much easier, and they're willing to kind of trudge through the difficulty in those early phases. And those people oftentimes being those early users. And sometimes we focus all of our energy and all of our attempt to try to help drive change just on that audience of those early people. But then you have all these other folks who, change is really difficult. It's a lot more scary for them to make those moves. And so like there can sometimes be that difficulty of like, one, you have the person who has the idea, who thinks they understand people, but then they run into this barrier because those people don't, they're not those early adopters, they're not those innovators. And then they're trying to
Yep.
address people as if they think the same way as them. But there's all these other barriers that are blocking that. So I don't know if that goes off into too much of a random rabbit hole, but I'm curious thoughts there.
No.
Like how do we help when we realize that there's all these different types of users who have different needs and different functions to be able to, make better progress, I guess.
Yeah. And that's a huge issue because yeah, those early adopters are great sources of feedback, but they have this limitation of they're going to engage just because they want to see how it works.
Hmm.
And you can't assume that that's the case once you get into early majority or late majority kinds of stuff. I don't think people talk about crossing the chasm that book anymore, or very much. I'm sure it still shows up, but it's this idea that like the genuine innovators and then early adopters are this point, and then there's a bit of a chasm between early adopters and early majority, late majority, and then there's
Hmm.
laggards at the end of it. And you need those majorities because that's where, the actual sales numbers are. But there was this chasm that would often occur where a bunch of nerd types, and I mean that,
It's a
positively. I
compliment
like
for those
nerds.
people
Yeah,
out there. Yeah.
exactly. A bunch of nerd types would go deep on this particular technology, but it wouldn't make this jump across to these people. And sometimes it's because the message was too complicated. Like the people who were really sophisticated about the technology were understanding what you were talking about and why this was better and why this was amazing new technology. But, your average person is like, yeah, but what is it going to do for me? How does this change my life? You're spouting numbers and statistics that mean nothing to me. I don't know what that looks like. The SEDMA conference was in Austin. Like as I was coming in, I was in a regular Uber, but I kept seeing the Waymo vehicles, which are the autonomous vehicles. And I've been seeing some of their TV commercials popping up. I think they're showing up on like YouTube or something, where they're talking about the problem of traffic accidents and traffic fatalities and how that's basically the sort of health crisis that we've all become just used to. And guess what? Waymo can help with that. Or maybe isn't going to answer everything, but it's part of the answer. Like we can reduce traffic fatalities. And they had another thing, I can't remember if it was like, independence for people who can't drive anymore or something. It had some other thing, but I'm like, they have some smart ad people who are like, don't tell me why this is awesome. Tell me why this solves real pain and problems for people in the world. Now, do I think that autonomous vehicles are ubiquitous good? We'll see. But they're doing that. They're doing that connection, right? Like they're doing the thing where they're like, it isn't just a convenience factor. It isn't just cool. Look how cool it is that we can have autonomous vehicles. It's how does this actually solve real world pain points that people have? So
Yeah, I think I don't know if this will sound controversial or not, but I will say one of the things that I've seen that is a fascinating case study I've seen in just my own work of people. So as an example, I have a friend who really extremely bright guy, right? Really, really smart guy who understands product really well. He was a great learning professional, loved to explain and teach things to people. And yet then because of his understanding of the product and all of these different elements, he was put into like a sales executive role, right? Where he's like, go articulate this to the customer.
uh,
And I mean, you might be able to sense what's going on here. He was terrible at it. He was
mhm.
really, really bad at it. And what's interesting is I think almost sometimes the more you know, like
Mhm.
this is gonna I know no hurt to my friends here in Utah, but we sometimes will have there's this comment of the sales bro, which I guess maybe exists across other places in the world, not just Utah. But like it's kind of the meathead person who isn't you're like, how is this guy so good at helping people to buy a product? Why how
Mhm.
but because you talk to him and you're like, there's nothing going on up there. I don't get it.
Mhm.
And yet for some reason there's a part of our brain that is like we get so we struggle with the complexity and all of the nuance and we just kind of want the like really easy answer. And so it's interesting how a lot of times there's this perception that the people who would go into a sales role aren't as smart. Like I'm trying not to be super controversial here, but like there's this idea that like sometimes when you know too much, you overcomplicate it for everybody else and they have a hard time getting where they need to be.
Mhm.
And so, like, I guess, I don't know if that resonates or if you've seen that in your own world, Julie, but like, how do we, I guess there's obviously that this difficulty in figuring out how to bridge that gap. You know, Waymo's trying to keep a really simple message. It sounds like, at least in the ads that you've seen around,
Mhm.
let's solve this one problem where it's like, well, maybe there's lots of benefits and there's lots of opportunities, there's tons of great things that you can do. But if you go too big, too fast, then it overwhelms us and then we tend to retreat. And so I guess how do you balance that? I don't know if there's probably a better question in there somewhere. I'm going to let you go where you want with that one, but
No, no, there's some good stuff there. It's interesting because I think there's a few different variables that are kind of showing up. Like the Waymo thing, I think, did a good job of only focusing on one problem per ad. Like I think they have some other ads that address different benefits of autonomous driving, but they don't try to be like, here, let me tell you all the reasons it's awesome in a single ad. They're like, no, we're just going to focus on this one thing. And we'll hope that you see, multiple ads and you see the different ways that it's beneficial. They're trying very much to kind of hit a some deep things there around, like, what's your trust with this technology, and is this like, oh, we're sort of bearing the lead a little bit, which is the claim that this is safer than human drivers, which, again, it depends, but, the the fact that some salespeople are really good at sort of building that relationship, which is almost always a part of a good sales process, but not overcomplicating the message. I'm an overcomplicate the message person. Like, I recognize it about myself. I'm like, let me tell you all this stuff because it's so cool and it's really interesting. And there's all this stuff behind it. I was working for a project years ago that was like a health app. Now we have, a million of them, but this was actually pre-smartphone. So this was an early attempt to do like health tracking and all that kind of stuff, but it was a website. And I was like, "Here, let me explain to you all the reasons why the science behind this site is really useful." And, like, the actual marketing people came in and they were like, "You are way overcomplicating this. You need something that, like, gets people excited." They had this, like, countdown thing because there was a little bit of a space metaphor we were using, and they had this little countdown thing, and it was beautiful, but it had, like, a tenth of the words that I had been trying to use to explain this stuff. And so recognizing where the strengths are for some of those kinds of things. And my lane is, let me help you understand some of the underlying principles behind this and some of the science behind it so that when you're having to make decisions in your own environment, you've got some firm ground to stand on if you decide if you're going to do A or B for some of these kinds of things. Well, I've been a small business owner for a long time, but I mostly stay in kind of the consulting space because even though I could grow the business, I'm like, I don't necessarily want to be the captain of the starship. I like science officer. That's where I'm happy. And so figuring out kind of how do you match up those things that people have to that good guidance for how do we communicate it? So your friend who super smart, really knows the product, all this kind of stuff, can they learn to be better at communicating the sales message? Probably. Is that ultimately really the best place and best role for them? Maybe not. So this is an interesting question for me right now because I'm working on a third book on skills development. One of the questions with skills development is, do you have aptitude for this skill? And aptitude is going to govern whether or not it's a pretty easy thing to pick up or really challenging. In terms of like how this all relates back to people creating the learning experiences, is I really think it is about making sure you understand and can simplify the message to how is this going to help you end user or how is this going to help you stakeholder, not getting into all of the the weeds behind the scenes of like how you figured all this stuff out or what the process is or what the instructional design material is or anything about your job is not to explain to them why this is a good instructional design. Your job is to explain to them why this is going to solve problems you have or challenges that you would like to achieve.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I might even say in some instances it's your job to, like, as the chief science officer, to be able to distill everything down into the so what, right? In the end.
Hmm.
There's a I have a friend whose wife is like, he said that's like the most loving thing that she says to him is, yeah, so what? Right? Meaning like he'll tend to think he has this great epiphany and he'll go share all these
Hmm.
great ideas with her. She's like, and like, okay, like who cares, right? And so the idea of being able to distill things down, like there's a big part of us, I think, that all everybody wants it to just be easy because, like, I love your point there about I know that talking to the elephant, one of the things that's so hard is how we make the right, feeling like we want to make the right decision and go the right direction. Maybe for the benefit of the audience who haven't read any of your books, maybe help us understand a little bit more about those analogies and why maybe they would be meaningful and helpful as you're trying to figure out decision making moving forward and helping other people make decisions and move forward.
Yeah, yeah, the elephant probably needs a little explaining. So there's a metaphor about the elephant and the rider, and it's not my metaphor. It's Jonathan Haidt from a book called The Happiness Hypothesis that he wrote in like I think the early 2000s. And he talks about how the brain is like if you think about the composition of your brain, you've got things down by your like the base of your skull, your spinal cord, on the top of your spinal cord that are like pretty primitive functions like breathing, heart rates, reflexes. Kind of in the back, you've got vision processing, you've got auditory processing, you've got gross motor control, and then you've got kind of fine motor control. And so, and then right in the middle of your brain, you've got the amygdala, which is fight or flight responses, emotional reactions, all these kinds of things. So basically, a large amount of your brain real estate is concerned with moving around and perceiving and moving around in the world, right? So what am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I feeling? How do I understand that? And then how do I use that information to pick up a coffee cup or to walk across the room or to do whatever, right? So a lot of your reality is centered very much in what's happening to me physically right now. And then we have other parts of the brain, and this is all like the brain regions are all a little bit, your whole brain gets engaged for most of these things. It's really pretty distributed. But nonetheless, there's certain areas that do kind of activate for certain things. And so, like, there's an area right behind your eyes called the prefrontal cortex, and that tends to activate when we're doing things like executive function, impulse control, projecting out into the future, kind of logic and reasoning. And again, these things distribute, but there are certain areas that activate a little bit more when we're doing some of those kinds of things. And these are great. These are huge advantages to us as humans to be able to project out into the future and consider a consequence. But so the metaphor is the all of the things that are concerned with what's happening in our visceral world right now. How do we feel about things? What is our physical reality? How do we perceive things? All this kind of stuff is all the elephant in Hate's metaphor. And then the rider is this little sort of verbal thinking conscious brain that does impulse control. It projects into the future. It, uses logical, it's part of a brain we kind of have a conversation with when we're thinking through something, that kind of stuff. And these are all metaphors and whatever. But so one of the things that we tend to do is we tend to talk mostly to the rider. And that's that logical argument. It's the science officer information. It's all of the stuff that, here's why this is the best and logically you should completely embrace this. But the elephant gets ignored in a lot of these conversations, especially when we're creating learning materials, because we're making this sort of logical argument. We're not considering what are people's experience in the world. And so one example I give of this is, I think we all intellectually know that texting while driving is a bad idea. Like nobody's missed this message. I mean, maybe there's some teenagers who still need to be informed, but by and large, we're all aware of that. And yet, it still happens. And so what's happening, like if we think about the experience that the rider has had the experience of public service campaigns saying, bad idea. The elephant, for the people who are still doing it, has probably had the experience of getting away with it a bunch of times. So we're stacking up this message, this intellectual message against this actual lived experience of, yeah, but I've gotten away with it. It's probably fine, right? And so when we have this disconnect between what the elephant understands and what the rider understands, that's where we tend to have behavior change issues. My own personal challenge area is sunscreen. Like, I know I need to do it. I know I do. I know I do. My parents have all both had basal cell stuff removed. I've even had it now and things like that, which is not serious, but it's still not great. You don't want it. And I'm like, I know I need to be diligent about sunscreen. And I don't have a problem remembering to put on sunscreen if I'm going to be like outside all day. But I know I should also just like do it on a daily basis, even if I'm like walking the dog for 10 minutes outside or whatever, and I'm kind of rocky on this. And the problem is my intellectual knowledge that I should use sunscreen is over here, but my actual experience of if I go outside with for 10 minutes with the dog, nothing bad happens. Now, granted, there might be a bad thing that's like 20 years in the future waiting for me because I didn't wear sunscreen on a daily basis when I was out walking the dog, but 20 years is a long time, right? So your elephant has a very strong present bias. If it's not a problem right now, it's kind of not a problem for the elephant. Your rider could project out into the future, but your elephant's like, no, I think it's okay. We'll be fine. That's right. And so that's one of the things that we need to figure out how to do a better job of with communicating these things. So if we're talking about some abstract feature benefit to our product, or even our learning materials, this will help with this thing that maybe you don't need to do right now. Well, that's not very compelling for
Hmm.
people. And they have to kind of force themselves to pay attention when it's something that they can't use immediately. And so the big issue is how do I make this feel present and immediate for you? How do I make this feel like something that is compelling right now, not compelling in the future?
I love that. And I think it goes back to why I think there are people who have the aptitude for sales versus the people who don't. And it's
Mhm.
oftentimes the people who have aptitude for sales understand how to talk to the elephant in that regard. Whereas it is interesting to me because I think I'm also one of those people who tends to overcomplicate things, but I also spend a lot of time talking to customers. And I
Mhm.
always oftentimes want to paint this big grand vision and all these things. And there's a maybe the thing that I thought of as you were talking about that is how often you can tell when there's a conflict with someone you're talking to between their rider and their elephant. Because that happens all the time. And usually it comes into that sounds great, but, right? Or
Mhm.
that would be awesome, but. And so there's
Mhm.
this conflict where the writer thinks this could be awesome, right? Or that would be really useful, or that will be really meaningful, but. And then what the
Yeah.
elephant is saying is, I'm fighting these fires right now, or that sounds really difficult. Well, that's going to take a lot of time to get to that point. And so, like, uh, I guess what have you seen as ways to overcome that a little bit, right? We both have the rider and the elephant, and you need to be able to speak to both of them. Oftentimes, the elephant it can kind of do what it wants, or it has a lot of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
here in a lot of instances. And so, yeah, what's some advice that we can do to help that, and how does that impact maybe we for the people like you and me who tend to overcomplicate things? What are some lessons that we could distill down that would be helpful, maybe as a starting point to be better at talking to the elephant?
Yeah, and it depends a little bit on, like, the context of the situation, obviously, but it's what can make this feel sort of immediate for me and kind of compelling. And I think the most useful thing is if you understand what problems they have, you show how it connects the dots, right? Like, that's gonna be the number one thing. But, you don't always have that, right? Maybe you haven't been able to unpack the issues that they're having or they're not being they don't necessarily know how to describe what their problems are or, things like that. And so then it becomes something like, how do I make this, feel more visceral or more immediate for people? So like one of the things I'm kind of obsessed with is hand washing, especially in like a healthcare context, because that's such an intellectual, like a rider versus elephant problem. Like if I show you my hand right now, it looks pretty clean, but intellectually we know that I'm touching stuff on my desk and whatever. And so it would not be okay for me to, provide medical care, which fortunately I don't have to do, but
Or
it would not be
stick
okay
your
with
hand in
without.
somebody's bowl of cereal? That would also
Yeah,
be.
yeah, exactly. Right, I would have to wash my hands first and, wash them carefully, like, with enough time and stuff like that. And so every hand washing curriculum you'll ever see in a healthcare and setting has some way to make the bacteria kind of real for people, right? Could be black light, that if you're well-resourced, that's usually the answer, right? Is you wash your hands and then you hold them under and you see where you still have bacteria in your hands, right? If you're old enough, I don't know if they still do this with kids, but if you're old enough, you remember the thing where you would chew the little red tablet after you brushed your teeth,
Mm,
and it would show you where the tartar was still on your teeth. Like, how do you make it feel real to people? And one of the big ways to make it feel real to people is to hear stories from people who are like you. It could be customer testimonials, it could be somebody explaining how this works. It could be seeing examples or scenarios where people who have look like me and feel like me are doing this with this software, and that's how it helps them. And so we're just trying to find different strategies. Once you've made the intellectual argument, there's nothing wrong with an intellectual argument. It's just that it's not going to be enough in a lot of cases. But once you've made the intellectual argument, can you connect it to something about their own experience? Can you connect it to something they care about? Another example that I talk about sometimes is how do you connect it to somebody's values, right? So, I collect hand washing campaign posters. I've got a lot of them. And there are ones that sort of, for kids that like connect it to, hey, you want to be an amazing baseball player, or you want to be a chef, or you want to be a movie star, or whatever. Here's how keeping yourself healthy now through hand washing is going to help you do those things. And so that's a little bit distant in the future, but I've also seen ones aimed at parents that say show a dad modeling hand washing for their kid and talk about how you want to be the example that keeps your children safe. Well, that goes to, that goes to some pretty deep values and identity and things like that. And so how do you connect those things up? This isn't just a good idea because hand washing is a good idea. It's a good idea because it helps you do things or helps you be a person that you really, really care about. There's ones for healthcare professionals that are like, hey, you got into this to help protect your patients and help people. Hand washing helps you do that. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the gist of the message. So when we're thinking about these things, getting beyond the surface of this is good, let me tell you that this is good and this is useful, and get into how does that actually tie into things that people are gonna really care about. Because I think I mentioned this in the keynote, was like, everybody's so busy that they don't know what to do. Like, they've got 37 different things they're supposed to be doing with every minute of every day, and if you only make the intellectual argument, you might be going in at number 38. Well, nobody gets to 38 in a day. I don't know how many open tabs you've got, but I've got a little app that gathers them up, but I'm like, "Oh, I should watch that webinar. I should read this article," or whatever. I've got, like, probably hundreds of those, and I do watch a lot of webinars and read a lot of articles, but not all the ones that I think would be, genuinely helpful for, understanding stuff. I'm never gonna get to all of it, so how do you get in it in the top 5 is really where you'd probably need to be in order to have a real shot at getting somebody's attention.
It's true. It's like, and on that number, there's all these different things I'm supposed to do every day. If you were to just think about software, right? Since this is SaaS therapy, the average end user probably has 30 to 40 applications that they're given, right? And so not only do I have all of these mental barriers of things that I'm trying to accomplish, but I also might have dozens and dozens of different ways to accomplish that. So it's like, well, I got to organize my task list. Well, I'm going to have to pick where I'm putting that task. In a corporate context, I might have to pick between Microsoft Planner and Jira and Microsoft To
Yeah.
Do, or just my notes app on my phone, or a Post-it that I have on my desk, right? And just for that one specific thing. And so, like, in the SaaS world, you're not just battling to like get recency, but you're also trying to articulate why your tool is the best one for that immediate
Yeah.
need too,
Yes,
And
absolutely.
and so I think that overcomplicates it, even, or not overcomplicates it. It makes it even more difficult for you as a SaaS vendor to get your message through, because you have to make the case that, like, this is the right tool now
Mhm.
because, and it's better than
Right.
these other tools or these other scenarios that you could be using. And sometimes saying that directly is exactly what a person needs to hear. But sometimes I don't know why that is, but maybe that's places where even the writer is hard or can get in the way. Cause I might be speaking to the elephant and say, this is the right tool right now for this thing. You should care about it. But then the writer's like, but I don't know, maybe not, but what about this thing,
Yeah.
this other thing? And so you all like, I don't know, there's this dissonance that seems to exist between like my present reality and my future reality. And then being able to balance all of that. It just, I don't know. I don't know that I've figured that all out all the way. I definitely haven't. Uh,
Yeah.
but
And
yeah,
I mean, in the elephant rider metaphor, it's been expanded out to talk about the jungle too, right? Like the path. It's so the elephant, the rider, and the path. The environment may or may not support certain things. But I would still argue that like having those conversations helps you understand that, right? Like, so even though you clearly have the best tool for XYZ, but there's something about their environment that makes that hard. Like, if they use this for task management, then it doesn't sync up over here or over here, and that's causes all sorts of problems, right? Like, this is not the best tool, but it's the tool everybody's using, so therefore I will also use it. And so understanding, but again, having those conversations and really spending time with people helps you understand like, oh, these are the limitations of their environment, and here's how we can still provide solutions to them, understanding, the limitations of their environment, because environment, matters hugely in behavior and is often a better way to modify people's behaviors than trying to like motivate them or convince them or things like that. Hand washing compliance went up. Oh gosh, I think it was like 40 to, like they jump from like 40% compliant to like 70% compliant with the addition of alcohol based hand rubs in a lot of clinic settings, right? So it was a change to the environment, not to convincing people it was more important. They just made it easier to do. It didn't take as much time and was more portable to wherever they were working and things like that. So,
Yeah, I don't know if you've read the book Atomic Habits by James Clear, but that popped up in my mind too of like, I think he talks about in that book about the story of Vietnam veterans who were doing
mhm.
really hard addictive drugs while as a coping mechanism for the war. And yet many of them came home. And then as soon as they changed the environment and they were bad, they were fine. And you're like,
Yeah,
how is it that you can go like take heroin or cocaine or something really horrible for you and then
yeah,
change the environment? And you're like, yeah, great. Like I'm fine.
yeah.
I'm okay.
And there were probably a lot of factors to that. So one was the social piece, right? Like if when they were in Vietnam, they had a bunch of other people who around them who were also doing hard drugs, and so therefore then they go back to regular life and their social connection around this is now gone and it's kind of doesn't feel like it's okay anymore. But then there's also just the logistics, right? I knew how to get those drugs in Vietnam. I don't necessarily know how to get drugs in, Missoula, Montana or something like that. I mean, they probably could have figured it out, but then there obviously the stress factor of being in Vietnam versus like, oh, we've relieved that stress, so there's a bunch of aspects to it. There's a social aspect, there's a practical aspect, there's an emotional aspect to that change in environment. And it's supposed to be incredibly difficult to get people to give up those drugs. And yet, yeah, in the example that he was talking about, which I've never investigated, so I don't know what the evidence base
Me
behind it
neither.
is, but it is a really compelling example when you think about it, and you're like, yeah, there are a bunch of things that changed right there. And, like social factors is a big, huge, factor for the elephant. The elephant cares very much what other elephants are doing. And so that social modeling or that social proof piece or being able to kind of see what other people are doing, that's I think a really underutilized tool in a lot of what we're doing is if I can see somebody else crushing it with this tool, I'm like, okay, tell me more.
Hmm. Yeah, I love it. There's been a lot of good ideas. Hopefully, as folks have listened today to this conversation, they're thinking, okay, how do I make my message easier? How do I figure out how to speak to the more immediate needs of my audience and to my user? How do I help them connect dots? And then also thinking about all these other examples. For me, I like these types of conversations because it always when you talk about things that are outside of your immediate context. Again, just like that example of scuba diving connecting to skiing, you all of a sudden start to your brain just starts to make those connections, which is awesome. So hopefully our audience has done that a little bit today. Julie, thank you so much for being on with us. We always ask our audience, or we always ask our guests one final question because this is meant to be a therapy session, right? It's a SaaS
Right, right, right.
and so any good therapy session ends with some level of homework, right? So if you could ask
Okay.
our audience to do one thing, like what one thing would you ask people to do as a result of listening to this conversation? Maybe something that they can apply and take with them as their own personal therapy homework assignment.
Okay, I'm gonna make my Kathy Sierra pitch. I started talking about her,
Yeah.
and you could get the book Badass, which I think is phenomenal, but there's easier avenues into it in that I'm pretty sure out on YouTube or Vimeo, I think it was one of the product conferences where she's done a few keynotes and things like that. And so those are easy to access and don't take as long as reading a book and they're free out there. We'll find some links you can put in the show notes maybe for some of her talks about it because I do think the fundamental thing is it's not that my product is awesome, it's that you'll be awesome using my products. Like if you can figure out ways to really connect those dots and help people understand that, I think you're golden if, at that point. So
It's so good. Julie, thanks again for joining us. If people want to get a hold of you, I know they can go to your website, usablelearning.com, probably find you on LinkedIn.
Yep.
Any other advice if people want to get a hold of you and how to find you?
I think those are the main ways. My books are the Design for How People Learn and Talk to the Elephant, Design Learning for Behavior Change are both available kind of on all the standard venues.
And
And
apparently a
yeah,
third one coming soon, it sounds like.
yeah, hopefully this fall it'll be out. That's the goal on how do you help people develop skills.
So good. Thanks again, Julie. And thanks to everyone who's with us. As always, we publish new episodes every Wednesday. Come back and keep joining us in these therapy sessions. Thanks, everybody. SaaS Therapy is brought to you by Brainstorm, the SaaS platform for SaaS adoption. Learn more at brainstorminc.com.